Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be responding to the claim that assisted suicide is a treatment option used to end a life of suffering in terminally ill patients. There was also another claim at the end, which was more of a claim of fact, that was terminally ill patients with incurable suffering should have the right to end their life, but which it was more of a policy issue in that one. The four secondary claims made by the advocate were assisted suicide alleviates suffering in patients, assisted suicide helps end a life discreetly, assisted suicide relieves the patient and family of undue stress, and assisted suicide is being implemented across the country. My response to the first claim, assisted suicide alleviates suffering in patients, is that the speaker argues that proponents of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide contend that terminally ill people should have the right to end their suffering with a quick, dignified, and compassionate death. And this is a bias claim because it argues that proponents of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide contend that they should have the right to end their suffering. And it's also more of a policy argument, and it should be more of a fact-based argument to back up the claim of fact. The claim was a little bit vague, and it was clarified to be for terminally ill patients with less than 6 months left to live. And if the patient was really suffering, then this would be justified. But if they were just going to be dying in 6 months, then they would be able to spend more time with family. And the level of suffering in patients differs greatly between different patients. And there are many other options than physician-assisted suicide that can help deal with the pain, especially palliative care. And the response to the second claim, assisted suicide helps end a life discreetly. The speaker doesn't elaborate on how discreet assisted suicide is or how it makes it more discreet to end a life, and if it should be discreet at all. There needs to be a connection with why discretion is a good thing in this case. Ronald Pies, an emeritus professor of psychiatry and a lecturer on bioethics in New York, says that, I believe the ambivalence and discomfort experienced by a substantial percentage of physician-assisted suicide participating physicians is directly connected to the Hippocratic Oath, arguably the most important foundational document in medical ethics. The oath clearly states, I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody if asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Most physicians have to take the Hippocratic Oath to be sworn in as a physician in med school or the residency. So one of the biggest things about the Hippocratic Oath is to do no harm to patients. So they would have to break their oath to help the patient kill himself. This also first the claim that it's more discreet because they may have trouble finding a doctor that's willing to help a patient end their life. It's also somewhat of a false dichotomy because doctors are going to exhaust every other option before resorting to assisted suicide. And it's their duty to help the patients to the best of their abilities. The speaker also mentioned Jack Kevorkian, or Dr. Death, who was charged for murder for ending his patient's life. And it raised a big controversy in the nation about assisted suicide, and it seemed to weaken the argument a little bit. For the third claim, assisted suicide relieves the patient and family of undue stress. There's already a large amount of stress in coming to the decision to end your life, and assisted suicide should be used as a last resort option because there's plenty of stress leading up to the death as well. For the fourth claim, assisted suicide is being implemented across the country. It's a bit of a contradiction to the fact in the first secondary claim that assisted suicide is legal in 7 US states and the District of Columbia, and it's really only starting to become legal in only some states. In an article from the website Death with Dignity, which is a site that advocates assisted suicide, they state that in 1906, the first euthanasia bill was drafted in Ohio, and it didn't succeed. So over 100 years after the introduction of the first bill for assisted suicide, a large majority of the states haven't legalized assisted suicide. The speaker gave the figure 7 states have legalized it, including the District of Columbia, which makes 86 states, or 86% of states not having legalized it. The speaker mentioned Oregon's Death with Dignity Act was passed into law in 1994 with 51% of voters in favor. And 51% is barely a majority and is sort of raises an issue of whether it should be passed into law. Assisted suicide is clearly a divisive issue, and I felt the speaker's points didn't seem to back up the argument that it should be legal. Thank you.
Okay, everything structural is listed pretty clearly at the beginning. When you talk about the first point on decreasing suffering, for instance, you kind of suggest that the information that they're citing is biased a little bit, that there's vagueness in the claim. I think some of the vagueness about the claim concerns the 6 months that these laws require. I think you could potentially present an argument that shows that this is an artificial time period, that's difficult to measure, that there's inconsistency on that, and that might maybe make your argument a little bit more substantive. I think you had a really good idea for an argument at the end of this point, suggesting that there are other options to alleviate suffering. You talk about palliative care, but that's all you say is palliative care. I'm sure some people aren't even sure what palliative care means. You need to explain that, and that it's easily accessible, that people who are terminally ill have access to the best kinds of drugs, that they don't worry about the side effects of, oh my gosh, I could become addicted. Well, you're going to be dead in 6 months, so nobody worries about that kind of addiction sort of thing at that particular point. So there are less consequences to that kind of thing. I think you could make the argument a little bit stronger, talking about how that addresses the issue of the suffering of the patients. The whole issue on discretion, I'm not exactly sure why that's important either. And you asked that question at the beginning. I thought that was a good question. I kind of like the answer that you come up with here, which says the problem is that it directly confronts the issue that the physician is faced with of contributing to somebody else's death, that is problematic, and that maybe the goal here is to remove the physician from that position a little bit. And you say there's something problematic about that. The physicians take an oath to do no harm. Doing what the advocate is talking about does some kind of harm, and that is in the long term problematic. I like that idea. Kevorkian comes up as an example by the advocate and by you, and I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to assess Kevorkian in this argument. On the third point, relieving stress, you basically just say, look, there's already a lot of stress. I'm going, yeah, okay, well, I think there might be other arguments here. For example, that this might be an inappropriate way of relieving stress, and there are other issues that come up when you say, why are we relieving stress? If grandma's got a lot of money and she's got to spend it all in order to maintain her life for 6 more months, but you're incentivizing her to end her life early so that she can leave you some money, yeah, that relieves stress too, but that's not exactly the kind of healthy thing that people want to do. So I think there are other arguments that you can make here. It just doesn't go very far with what you're doing. And I'm not sure that it was well documented on the other side. I don't remember what the evidence was on that particular point. And then on the last point, you do kind of diminish the significance of the trend that's going on there. I think you do that pretty well. You demonstrate, for instance, that it's been a long time that people have been pursuing this, that it's relatively recent that any of these have been passed, that they've been passed by a minimal amount of votes, and that it's still 86% of the states reject this. I thought that those were all reasonably solid answers to that particular point. Okay, thank you.